I approve of the means proposed to eradicate this evil race of people, hateful to God and harmful to men. The king will do a great service to God our Lord if he succeeds in extinguishing these people." End quote. These were the words of the Jesuit confessor to King Ferdinand VI in response to a proposal to exterminate the Gypsy people. I'm David Cott, host of New History of Spain, and today I will explain a dark chapter of Spanish history. A silent history absent from schools and often ignored in accounts written by non-gypsies. Yet this silence doesn't make the genocide of the gypsies any less real. Stay with me to the end to honor the victims of the most savage persecution of gypsies in Spanish history. Before delving into the Great Gypsy Roundup of 1749, it's crucial to understand how gypsies were perceived and treated beforehand. Societies don't leap from coexistence to a desire for extermination overnight. By the way, I call them gypsies instead of Roma people or Romani, even though I know the word has a more negative connotation in English. I do this because gypsy is a more literal translation of gitano, the term used in Spanish, and more importantly, it's how they proudly identify themselves. Originating in northwest India, gypsies migrated across Europe, shaping their unique identity. They first arrived in Spain in 1425 and were initially tolerated. However, from 1499 to 1783, over 250 laws were enacted to expel them or erase their cultural identity. In early modern Spain, gypsies stood out for their nomadic lifestyle, distinctive clothing, and language. By the mid-18th century, after centuries of coexistence and repression, most gypsies had settled and abandoned their language. The few cultural markers they retained were their clothing and their strong family and community bonds. Unlike Jews or Moriscos, the persecution of gypsies wasn't motivated by politics, religion, or economics, nor was it generally rooted in racism based on skin color. In fact, it was often difficult to identify a gypsy by appearance alone. The greater resentment came from their nomadic way of life and the thefts committed by some gypsies, which earned them a negative reputation throughout Europe. For gypsies, guilt was presumed. In early modern Spain, they were labeled as false paupers, considered lazy and wicked, living off charity or crime. Yet this stereotype didn't align with reality. By the 18th century, many gypsies were blacksmiths, shearers, horse trainers, or livestock traders. The issue was that governments enacted laws explicitly banning them from pursuing any economic activity other than farming. According to the Pragmatic Sanction of 1717 and earlier laws, gypsy men were sentenced to serve as galley rowers if they practiced any trade other than farming, traded in livestock, attended fairs or markets, wore traditional gypsy clothing, or used unique gypsy jargon when speaking Spanish. Gypsy women faced whipping and expulsion from the kingdom for the same offenses. A 1745 law even permitted the killing of gypsies, armed or not, if they were found outside their assigned places of residence. Out of the 75 towns in Spain where gypsies were allowed to live, the law permitted only one gypsy family per 100 residents. This was meant to monitor them, enforce assimilation, and break family and community bonds. Spain's forced assimilation policies were rife with contradictions. How could the state aim to integrate gypsies and turn them into productive Spanish subjects devoid of their cultural identity, while simultaneously forbidding them from engaging in most trades, traveling to the Americas, or even leaving their assigned towns? By not providing them access to land ownership and outlawing the trades that sustain them, the state forced gypsies into illegality and marginalization. Of course, we cannot always portray gypsies as victims, because it is true that some committed crimes not out of necessity, but as a way of living at others' expense. However, first, individual crimes cannot be equated with the institutional violence of the state, and second, it is always unjust to generalize and treat all gypsies as criminals, as was done historically and as many still do today in Europe. Anti-gypsy racism remains one of the most socially accepted forms of discrimination. This created a vicious cycle. The exclusion and legal discrimination of gypsies kept them at the margins of society, driving some toward criminal activities and antisocial behavior. This, in turn, fueled their negative reputation and harsher repressive measures. The Council of Castile, the highest governing body of 18th century Spain, acknowledged that the number of settled gypsies had increased, and admitted its mistake in only allowing gypsies to work the land. However, it continued to claim that gypsies committed crimes and that even granting them land ownership wouldn't rid them of their vices. This assertion contradicted reality, as there were already gypsy families who owned land and worked it honorably. Yet, with the conviction that the 11,000 or 12,000 gypsies in the Kingdom of Spain were hopeless social parasites, the government sought a final solution: their extermination. There is some debate about who masterminded the genocide. Some point to the Marquess of Ensenada, effectively the Prime Minister of King Ferdinand VI, while others blame Gaspar Vázquez Tablada, the Governor of the Council of Castile and Bishop of Oviedo. Since I haven't accessed the primary sources linking Ensenada to the plan, I will lean toward Vázquez Tablada. In truth, it doesn't matter much. Both work closely together on this extermination plan. Vázquez Tablada made solving the so-called gypsy problem his personal mission. Upon becoming governor of the Council of Castile in 1746, Vázquez Tablada reminded local administrations of the need to rigorously enforce anti-gypsy laws, blaming leniency for their ineffectiveness. By mid-1747, he proposed to King Ferdinand VI a plan to end the gypsy problem once and for all, either through expulsion or imprisonment. By mid-1747, he proposed to King Ferdinand VI a plan to end the gypsy problem once and for all, either through expulsion or imprisonment. One obstacle was the right of sanctuary, which gypsies often used to avoid arrest by seeking refuge in sacred spaces. The government negotiated with the Holy See and by 1748 secured the Pope's authorization to remove gypsies from churches and convents. With this obstacle removed, the genocide could be planned. A council debated whether it would be better to simply expel the gypsies and send them to the Americas. However, they consulted the Portuguese ambassador about his country's experience, since Portugal had expelled gypsies to Brazil and African colonies just 3 years earlier. The ambassador reported that gypsies had caused problems in Brazil and that some of them had already returned to Portugal. Thus, a more radical measure was chosen: to arrest all gypsies in the kingdom, regardless of age or gender, and segregate men and women to prevent reproduction, ensuring the eventual disappearance of gypsies. Before anyone claims, hey, this isn't a genocide, let me read Article 2 of the 1948 United Nations Genocide Convention. Quote, "In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. As such, A. Killing members of the group. B. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. D. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. E. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group." End quote. As we will see, the Great Gypsy Roundup of 1749 satisfies points B, C, D, and E against an entire ethnic group, making it a textbook genocide, just as the one happening in Palestine today. It's also a common misconception that genocide only applies if every member of a group is killed. If that were the case, the term would hardly ever be applicable. By the way, these genocidal ideas against gypsies weren't new. In 1596, a report already proposed separating gypsies by gender and taking their children. And in 1616, a theologian cited a biblical passage to justify the killing of gypsies, including children. In 1749, Gaspar Vázquez Tablada presented his proposal to the Council of Castile. Pay close attention to the dehumanizing language he used, portraying gypsies as a disease and inherently criminal. Quote, "We endure their impiety, their thefts, their deceit, their sacrileges, and their vagabond nature. The public good in their eradication becomes evident when considering that gypsies are not like other criminals, whose crimes end with their lives. Gypsies are sinners for life and criminals by race, and thus their crimes multiply with them, as husband and wife teach their children to be like them. Their excesses and crimes pass from generation to generation. It is therefore virtuous to cut the thread of these successive evils and eradicate from the kingdom such an impious race, which with its multiplication oppresses His Majesty's subjects, living almost always in offense to God with no hope of amendment." End quote. Beyond ensuring biological extermination through the prevention of procreation, the plan had a utilitarian purpose for the state, to avoid economic losses from their imprisonment. The penalty of galley rowing had been abolished a few months earlier because advances in 18th century naval technology made rowers unnecessary. However, the Marquess of Ensenada needed cheap labor to build ships and bolster the Spanish Armada. What better source of cheap labor than enslaved gypsies, who will cost only their upkeep? Thus, gypsy men and boys over 7 were added to the ranks of forced laborers alongside enslaved Turks and North Africans, vagrants, and criminals. There was no grand plan for making gypsy women useful because Ensenada, in his disregard for women, saw them as burdens. He only wanted to confine them in hospices, houses of mercy, or castles, where they would perform so-called women's tasks, such as weaving textiles to cover their maintenance costs. Once boys turned 7, they were separated from their mothers and sent to shipyards. The Marquess of Ensenada was tasked with organizing the military and logistical preparations for the operation. The roundup was to be conducted simultaneously across all municipalities known to have gypsy populations to prevent escape and dispersion. Based on census records, the Council of Castile knew the locations of at least 881 gypsy families in 54 towns. Ironically, those gypsies who had complied with the laws mandating forced settlement were the easiest to capture. No matter how integrated they were, their fate was decided in an office in Madrid. The Marquess of Ensenada issued secret orders to military commanders, local magistrates, and judicial authorities to carry out the roundup. These instructions were prefaced with the following justification for such an extreme measure, quote, "Since all the measures and orders issued by His Majesty to contain the lazy and harmful gypsies infecting Spain have failed to achieve the desired Catholic goal, and since they persist in their vile crimes and disrupt the country's peace, a remedy must be applied to cure such a grave disease, exterminating them all at once." End quote. The operation began in the early hours of July 31st, 1749. Military units surrounded the homes of gypsies with known addresses, removed them from their dwellings, and separated them by gender before taking them to temporary detention centers. Those who sought refuge in sacred spaces could be forcibly removed, and any who managed to flee were to be hunted down until none remained free in Spain. The possessions of the gypsies were confiscated and auctioned to offset the costs of the operation. However, since gypsies were generally poorer than non-gypsy Spaniards, the proceeds were far from sufficient. According to historian Manuel Martinez, 7,760 gypsies were arrested between July 31st and October 4th. This number does not include those who died, fled before being recorded, or were captured in towns not listed in the original July order. The real figure is estimated to have been around 9,000 individuals across Spain. These 9,000 people were detained without any legal process for the great crime of being gypsies. In Murcia, for instance, among those arrested was a wealthy gypsy who had supplied the army with thousands of horses and house soldiers in his inns. But none of this mattered. He was still a gypsy and received no special treatment. Breaking down the arrests by region, Andalusia, historically home to the largest gypsy population, saw nearly 5,000 captured, more than half the total. It was followed by Catalonia with 686, Murcia with 640, and the Valencian community with 599. No arrests were made in the Basque Country or Navarre, as strict local laws already prohibited gypsies from entering or residing there, even though some gypsy families are known to have lived there, integrated into the local population. In Extremadura, fewer than 200 were arrested, as many fled to Portugal, where gypsy presence was also prohibited. The execution of the roundup was not without complications. In Málaga, Cádiz, Almería, and Catalonia, the arrest orders didn't arrive until the second half of August, disrupting coordination. The governor of Almería reported that upon hearing of the arrests in other towns, local gypsies sold their animals and belongings at rock-bottom prices to prevent anything of value from being confiscated. Across Spain, some gypsies escaped the military cordon, dispersing or continuing their nomadic lifestyles in defiance of the law, a survival strategy that worked to their advantage. Some sought refuge in remote villages, posing as beggars, while others formed groups that roam from town to town, camping on the outskirts to remain mobile. In Triana, Seville, a colonel reported that 2 gypsies attempting to flee on horseback were shot and killed, another was injured, and one drowned in the Guadalquivir River in front of his wife and children. However, for the most part, there was little resistance to the arrests. Some gypsies who avoided capture during the initial operation voluntarily turned themselves in to authorities in the days that followed. In many towns where the order hadn't arrived, gypsy families stayed put, believing the arrests only targeted those who hadn't complied with forced settlement laws. In Vélez Málaga, soldiers were shocked to see gypsies voluntarily going to jail. Obviously, they were only so obedient because they were unaware that the plan was to imprison them for life and separate them from their families, all without having committed any crime beyond being gypsies. The situation raised questions about whom the soldiers were supposed to arrest. Some individuals held the status of Old Christians and Castilians or were in mixed marriages. Due to the prevailing patriarchal mindset, it was decided not to pursue gypsy women or their children in marriages with non-gypsy husbands. But gypsy men married to non-gypsy women were arrested. Others claimed to be mixed black, mestizos, or simply Spaniards whose disreputable professions led to their classification as gypsies. There were also instances of local politicians exploiting the persecution to target personal enemies by having them labeled as gypsies. Amid this madness, there were examples of non-gypsies protecting gypsies. The Archbishop of Seville protested the removal of gypsies who had sought refuge in a convent, demanding they not face corporal punishment or be sent to shipyards, mines, or penal colonies in North Africa. In the Valencian town of Jarafuel, the local priest refused to hand over a gypsy couple who had sought sanctuary in his church, forcing soldiers to enter by force. A priest in Puente de Don Gonzalo, Córdoba, hit a gypsy servant and refused to turn him over. A complaint was filed about a doctor of gypsy descent, showing that gypsies also held prestigious professions. In Málaga, the city council supported the petition of gypsy blacksmiths to be exempt from the arrest, highlighting their social integration and importance to the local economy. In Cogolludo, Guadalajara, when soldiers from Madrid arrived in August and sought the mayor's assistance in capturing gypsies, the mayor discreetly had a trusted aide warn a well-known gypsy couple in town to help them escape. While such acts don't change the fact that anti-gypsy sentiment was widespread in Spain, they show that not everyone viewed gypsies as subhuman parasites. The military and police operation of the Great Gypsy Roundup was quite successful, but what followed was chaos. The secrecy surrounding the plan meant there had been little consideration of where to house thousands of people who needed to be monitored and fed. Local authorities were overwhelmed by the logistical challenges and the costs of maintaining so many detainees. The 9,000 individuals arrested were held in provisional facilities while their final fate was decided. Improvisation was necessary. Some ended up in prisons, others in dilapidated castles, and even cheap houses in peripheral neighborhoods were used, effectively placing some women and children under house arrest. Some male detainees were immediately sent to the La Carraca shipyard in Cádiz and the Cartagena shipyard to put them to work as the Marquess of Ensenada envisioned. However, August was chaotic, with protests piling up from detained gypsies, overwhelmed authorities, and non-gypsy neighbors calling for their release. The situation became a political disaster, and someone had to take the fall. King Ferdinand VI dismissed the architect of the roundup, Gaspar Vázquez Tablada, governor of the Council of Castile. The plan for extermination had to be abandoned, and a new approach for dealing with the gypsies was required. Francisco Rábago, the king's confessor, wrote the following in late September to absolve Ferdinand VI, quote, "The current state of this matter is disastrous due to enormous errors in the planning and even greater errors in the execution, which went against the king's intentions. His Majesty never ordered the arrest and mistreatment of those who only bore the name of gypsies because their parents or grandparents were gypsies, despite having abandoned that lifestyle and living peacefully like other neighbors in their trades or farming. Such actions will be a grave injustice, a betrayal of public trust, and against His Majesty's interests. The king's true intention was only to arrest harmful, vagrant, and vicious gypsies without trades or honest means of livelihood. That was the king's intention and could never have been otherwise. That was the order given to the authorities, with the assistance of troops to ensure proper execution. But the result has been not only contrary but deeply unjust, as many loyal subjects were arrested and mistreated simply for bearing the names of gypsies, with countless abuses and personal vendettas mixed in, and their belongings unjustly seized." End quote. This statement from Rábago is unconvincing, not least because he himself had previously expressed support for the genocide of the gypsies, as shown in an earlier quote at the beginning of this episode. In fact, the word all was retroactively struck out from the secret orders of July, which had initially stated that the king had decided to arrest all settled and nomadic gypsies in the kingdom, without exception of gender, status, or age. Perhaps Rábago later experienced moral regret or saw the political disaster that the operation had become. However, King Ferdinand VI cannot feign ignorance of what he authorized. This statement was clearly an attempt to repair his damaged image, but he bore as much, if not more, responsibility than anyone else. The Marquess of Ensenada blamed local authorities for supposedly misinterpreting the orders, an attempt to absolve himself of responsibility for an operation he had personally directed. On September 7th, a council of figures uninvolved in the original project convened to deliberate on what to do with the gypsies. Once again, the idea of deporting them to the Americas was rejected to prevent them from spreading quote-unquote bad habits to the indigenous population, or engaging in smuggling with foreign powers. A royal order issued on October 28th declared that any gypsy married by the church, holding Castilian status, or able to prove they lived in accordance with the rule of one gypsy family per 100 residents, will be released and have their belongings returned. Pardoned gypsies were to be instructed on how to live properly and were forbidden from identifying as gypsies to ensure the term itself disappeared. They were required to register and pay taxes and were still prohibited from leaving their assigned municipalities. Men who did not meet these criteria were to work in military shipyards and public works, while women and girls were sent to houses of mercy. Gypsies who had evaded capture were given 1 month to present themselves to the authorities and receive a pardon, provided they had no other legal issues. The collective punishment for being gypsies shifted toward a more individualized approach. With the October Order, the genocide plan was diluted, as most gypsies returned to their communities and could once again procreate. However, the backdown was incomplete, as thousands of gypsies remained detained and separated from their families, likely to avoid acknowledging the severe crime and political error that had been committed. By March 1750, 4,402 individuals had been released, while 3,268 remained in detention. After that, releases slowed to a halt. Gypsies were still presumed guilty by default, and there were no trials requiring the state to prove that detainees were not settled and employed. Predictably, the partial release of gypsies was rife with arbitrariness, a fact even reported by some officials overseeing their detention. It was not uncommon for a husband to be released while their wife and children remained detained, or vice versa. The likelihood of release depended primarily on 2 factors: One was having good contacts or a favorable reputation among local elites, neighbors, or councils who could write positive reports supporting the pardon. For example, the mayor of Orihuela secured the release of all gypsies in his town. The governor of Toledo remarked to Ensenada his surprise at finding so many supporters of the gypsies, especially in Andalusia, where they were more numerous and better integrated. Many detained gypsies believed their continued imprisonment was due to local authorities' unwillingness to return confiscated property, which had often already been auctioned off. The second factor enabling pardon was financial means to cover bureaucratic fees or bribe officials to speak favorably on their behalf. The poorest and most marginalized, with no advocates, were doubly punished for being gypsies and for being poor, and they remained in detention. The over 3,200 individuals still detained as of March 1750 faced years of forced labor and neglect until the pardon of 1765. Most of the men and boys over the age of 7 were sent to the shipyards in Cartagena, La Carraca, and Ferrol, while some in Catalonia were employed in other public works. The use of gypsies as forced labor in shipyards was not new. Smaller-scale roundups had taken place in 1571 and 1639 to supply rowers for galleys. The goal was to exploit them as slaves, replacing salaried laborers to build ships for the Spanish Navy, which was undergoing modernization and rearmament under the Marquess of Ensenada. Nearly 1,200 gypsies were sent to the shipyard at La Carraca in Cádiz, though over 500 were released following the October pardon. The shipyard's superintendent warned Ensenada about the physical and mental degradation of the gypsies, even after only 6 months of confinement. They lacked adequate winter clothing, leaving them vulnerable to illness, and their morale had plummeted in the face of the injustice they endured. The superintendent complained of insufficient funds to feed them all, a lack of space to house them, and too few personnel to guard them. His repeated complaints led to 543 gypsies being transferred in January 1752 to the newly founded shipyard in Ferrol, Galicia. However, tragedy struck during the transfer, as over 200 gypsies died from an epidemic. Diseases spread easily among the enslaved gypsies, who were forced to sleep in unsanitary conditions. Between 1753 and 1757, 3/4 of the gypsies were hospitalized at least once, with an average stay of 103 days. At the Cartagena shipyard, historian Manuel Martinez estimated that roughly 20% of the detained gypsies died. To address material shortages, the governor of Alicante allowed 5 gypsies in the summer of 1751 to leave the castle and beg for alms on behalf of the group, and many locals responded with help. While the state viewed the gypsies as subhuman resources to exploit, ordinary people often responded with humanity when confronted directly with their suffering and misery. Regarding their working conditions, gypsy men were almost always shackled with chains and leg irons. This made it impossible for them to perform certain tasks requiring full mobility, and of course, made their existence all the more miserable. The gypsies did not accept their loss of freedom quietly and demonstrated resistance in various ways: working slowly, feigning ignorance, acting defiantly, committing thefts and sabotage, prolonging hospital stays, and above all, attempting to escape. In 1749, 12 gypsies escaped from Cartagena shipyard and its hospital. In July 1750, 16 gypsies attempted to flee while being chained to their galleys for the night. The leader of the escape explained that he could no longer endure the miserable conditions of working there or the pain of being separated from his wife and children. Unable to meet the October's pardon's requirements, the gypsies openly admitted they had lost all hope of regaining their freedom. It's important to note that they were never explicitly informed that the authorities aimed to extinguish their population and prevent procreation. In a rare moment of humanity, Ensenada instructed the Cartagena superintendent to withdraw the wine rations of escapees and reserve the death penalty only for mutineers. This leniency encouraged further escape attempts, as the gypsies realized they had little to lose and much to gain. Between 1752 and 1765, there were 335 escape attempts by gypsy men and boys, 85% of which were successful due to poor surveillance. Given the data on escapes, deaths, and hospitalizations, it is doubtful whether the exploitation of gypsy slave labor was economically profitable for the state. Their productivity was low due to apathy and rebellious attitudes caused by the injustice of their confinement and the absence of any hope for release. Moreover, most gypsy men had honest jobs before their imprisonment and were not criminals, meaning society lost the value they had already been contributing. While the exploitation of gypsy men's labor was questionable in terms of profitability, the women, girls, and boys under 7 clearly caused financial losses. This was primarily because Ensenada paid little attention to them and only vaguely considered using them in textile manufacturing. However, this plan never materialized on a larger scale due to logistical challenges, lack of initiative among officials, and resistance from the women. Initially, they were mostly confined to the Alcazaba or Citadel of Malaga and the castles of Valencia and Denia. But those who were not pardoned were eventually transferred to the House of Mercy in Zaragoza. In total, over 850 women, girls, and young children were sent to Zaragoza. This transfer was against the will of the institution's governing board, which had new arrivals forced upon them. They were compelled to construct 2 additional facilities to house the growing population. At Zaragoza, the women were employed in spinning wool and hemp to cover their upkeep, earning wages even lower than those of other poor non-gypsy women in the institution. Mothers were even separated from their daughters because the governing board believed they exerted a negative influence on them. Lack of resources for proper care was a constant issue. The warden of the Almagro jail in Ciudad Real documented the appalling conditions faced by the woman in his custody. The overcrowded facility led to the spread of disease, and there were no means to treat the sick. Gypsy women detained there in 1753 petitioned for their freedom, complaining about the grueling labor, lack of clothing, and illness. They were so desperate they said they will accept any fate, even death, to escape their suffering and the relentless persecution they had always faced for being gypsies. Between December 1750 and the same month in 1751, 146 people died in the Alcazaba of Malaga, mostly elderly women and children who were the most vulnerable to unsanitary conditions. Gypsy women were more openly rebellious than the men, knowing the punishments they faced were less severe. Mutinies, assaults on guards, and general insubordination were frequent, aiming to make their detention intolerable and costly for authorities and to pressure for their release. At the House of Mercy in Zaragoza, infrastructure was regularly damaged. Women often tore their clothing and walked around nearly naked to express their discontent and inflict financial losses on their captors. They acted in solidarity to strengthen their demands and prevent abuses. Despite the presence of guards, escapes occurred, the most significant being in 1753, when 52 women broke through a wall and fled unnoticed, although most were recaptured in the following days. We have already seen the conditions under which the gypsies lived while their freedom was denied. But how did their eventual liberation come about? In 1754, the Duke of Caylus, Captain General of Valencia, suggested freeing all the gypsies or sending them to the Americas. The Duke of Caylus had participated in the roundup and held many prejudices against gypsies, but over the years, as he came to know them personally, his perspective changed. However, the Marquess of Ensenada, still obsessed with repressing the gypsies, refused to release the women under Caylus's charge. After Ensenada fell from grace in mid-1754, the issue of the imprisoned gypsies was forgotten, until Charles III ascended to the throne 5 years later. Between 1752 and 1765, only 14 gypsies were released from the Cartagena shipyard, despite their protest that they had not been convicted in any trial or informed of the length of their sentence. In 1757, the superintendent of La Carraca asked the Council of Castile for authorization to free the few gypsies still detained there, citing documents attesting to their good character. The council rejected the request outright, stating that no appeals for their release would be considered, as their confinement had been resolved to last until their deaths. The women at the House of Mercy in Zaragoza were more fortunate. Almost 200 were freed between 1759 and 1760 after family members advocated for them, and by 1763 only 45 remained, who were freed when Charles III announced his pardon. By 1762, 79 gypsies remained in the Ferrol shipyard, 85 in Cartagena and only one in La Carraca, 165 in total. 3 of the Cartagena detainees had obtained permissions for their wives to live in Cartagena, and others had secured permission for their families to live in nearby towns. This suggests that conjugal visits were eventually allowed. Combined with the fact that most gypsies in Spain were already free, it was absolutely senseless to keep some detained solely for being gypsies, especially when the original plan had been to prevent their reproduction. The most egregious case was that of 41 gypsies from Puerto de Santa Maria, Cádiz, who had been captured in a 1745 local roundup and forced to work in the dangerous mines of Almadén for 4 years. Their scheduled release coincided with the Great Roundup, so they were not freed, with some remaining in prison for nearly 20 years simply for being gypsies. I also want to share the heart-wrenching testimony of young Andalusian gypsies whose childhoods were stolen, to remind us that behind the statistics and explanations, there were real people suffering. Quote, "To Your Excellency, with the most humble and respectful veneration, the 24 gypsies residing in the Ferrol shipyard submit to your merciful consideration. These unfortunate individuals remain without any hope of freedom, being orphans with no one to advocate for us, as others have done by justifying their conduct with documents from their local authorities. These petitioners, abandoned due to the death of their parents and relatives and being too young at the time of their capture to know justice or find anyone to help them, appeal to Your Excellency's compassionate heart. It will suffice to expose to Your Excellency's pious heart how these unfortunate people suffer innocently, having been apprehended almost without the use of reason. This circumstance is so painful to them that now, more than ever, they feel the painful mortification of 15 years of slavery. This is sufficient reason to give voice to such a just sentiment. Given that Your Excellency has such a benevolent heart, accompanied by Christian zeal, they humbly seek refuge under Your Excellency's powerful protection. They implore you to look upon them with eyes of mercy, considering that these unfortunate people suffer unjustly and that nothing will satisfy them more than the liberty with which they were born." End quote. Upon taking the throne, Charles III expressed his desire to free the remaining gypsies. He sought the opinions of the kingdom's captain-generals, who were reluctant. However, the king remained steadfast, driven by morality, the recognition that the original extermination goal had failed in the very year of the roundup, and the financial burden of maintaining the detainees. In June 1763, Charles III approved a general pardon inspired by the Duke of Cailus's proposal, though the gypsies were not truly freed until 1765, due to bureaucratic delays in finding places for them to settle. They were very quick to imprison them, but to give them back their stolen freedom, they took their time. On July 6, 1765, the 75 gypsies still in the Cartagena shipyard were released. 2 gypsies who had been forgotten while working as road foremen were the last to be freed in March 1767. Thus ended one of the darkest chapters in Spanish history. Yet, just as genocidal ideas do not arise overnight, neither do they disappear quickly. In 1771, the Count of Aranda proposed not just separating children under 7 from their mothers, but taking them away at birth. The Count of Campomanes suggested sending gypsies to American colonies and continuing to segregate them by gender to prevent reproduction. Paradoxically, in his report, Campomanes admitted that excluding gypsies from many professions, along with the lack of land ownership and education for their children, had pushed them into marginalization and crime. The debates culminated in the Pragmatic Sanction of 1783, which sought to integrate gypsies into Spanish society. The law declared all work honorable and allowed gypsies to pursue any profession and reside anywhere in the kingdom, except Madrid. They still didn't want them in the capital. The condition was that they abandon their itinerant lifestyle, language, and traditional dress. The law extended an olive branch to productive gypsies, but retained repressive measures against their cultural identity. In the Pragmatic Sanction, Charles III stated, quote, "Those who are called gypsies are not so by origin or nature, nor do they descend from any infected root." End quote. At least this marked the end of the genocidal rhetoric describing gypsies as a disease to be eradicated from Spain. The consequences of the Great Gypsy Roundup of 1749 were numerous. The divide, distrust, and hostility between gypsies and non-gypsies deepened significantly due to the grave injustice that was committed. The efforts of the vast majority of gypsies to live a sedentary and integrated life in their communities were destroyed, leaving gypsy families even more marginalized and impoverished as a result of the genocide and the loss of their possessions. In some cases, they were able to recover their property, but restitution was rarely complete, and in some cases, they recovered nothing. Such was the abuse suffered by over 70 gypsy women released in Malaga. When they demanded the return of their belongings, the authorities threatened to imprison them again, silencing them out of fear. Freedom was stripped from 9,000 gypsy men, women, and children for at least a few months simply for being gypsies, without any trial or opportunity for defense. Thousands of gypsies were deprived of their freedom for several years, and several hundred lost over 15 years of their lives. Hundreds of births were prevented due to the separation of men and women. No historian has yet calculated the total number of deaths caused by the roundup, but based on the scattered data I have gathered, I can assure you there were over 500 deaths, and I am nearly certain that more than 1,000 avoidable deaths occurred under dire conditions. Above all, the Great Roundup caused immense suffering and a sense of injustice, though such impacts cannot be quantified in statistics. If there is one thing to take away from this story, let it be this. Genocides cannot happen without first dehumanizing the targeted group. Gaspar Vázquez Tablada, the Marquess of Ensenada, and King Ferdinand VI could not have carried out their plan to exterminate the gypsies without the support of numerous civilian, military, and ecclesiastical collaborators, along with many Spaniards who shared their views. This mindset was the result of centuries of discrimination and dehumanization of gypsies, which preceded the genocide and continued for centuries afterward. Don't stay silent when you see dangerous steps being taken in hateful rhetoric toward any vulnerable group. That concludes today's episode. If you learned something new and are new here, please subscribe to New History of Spain on YouTube or listen to the podcast if you prefer just the chronological series about the history of Spain. Researching history takes a lot of work, so if you believe my historical content is valuable, consider joining the community of Patreons at patreon.com/newhistoryspain or making a one-time donation. The links are below. Thank you very much for listening and see you next time!